So how to begin? I think all projects start by, in many ways, being blank, not having a lot of expectation about what I'm going to find. And it's like listening and like putting up antenna. It's like the hair that sticks out of your arms, you know, like what is in the place that I might be working, and who are the people, and what are the resources, and what feels like, where's there a question to kind of rub up against. But it's to kind of always try to start in some ways with nothing. And then, of course, you realize you have your habits and you have your predilections towards certain things. And in some ways, I feel like mine are always trying to get back to my very first hand, which is a textile hand, which is a sewing hand. I grew up knitting and embroidering and doing a lot of lap work with my grandmother. And it was interesting because when I went to graduate school, and I remember there was an interview, and I had taken the train from Montreal and was extremely nervous. And I remember one of the questions was a very leading question, and it was like, you don't do this weaving stuff anymore, do you? Seriously. And I could tell by the tone of the question I was supposed to say, no, I don't do this stuff. And you know, it's really been interesting because now in, 40 years of working, it's all weaving. And it's all the underlayment for putting things into relation come from that first hand. And it doesn't mean that I'm literally weaving or that I'm literally sewing or knitting, but it does mean that there's a sensibility that comes from how a single thread can structure a whole cloth. And that has a lot to do with the scale in my work. And in many ways, it's like when I start a project and I'm drawn to the thread, to the materials of work, it's to try to understand what that attraction is. And I think with sewing, it's the most fundamental thing, like a needle goes down through a cloth and it disappears. And then it comes back up and you can see it again. And it's this rhythm of this going down and not being visible and it coming back up. And every time it does that, it's a little different. And there's a way that the body thinks when it's in motion. And so in some ways, I'm not in work now literally weaving, but the rhythms of the work come from that coordination of mind and hand and mind wandering. So I wanted to, I guess, say, it's really always important to trust that whatever you call your first hand, and trust that there's a way to work out of that, and to respect it. Yeah. So I'm in the middle of a project now with a fabric workshop in Philadelphia, and I feel like, oh, maybe I get to sew again, and maybe I get to come back to that lap work in a way that I haven't been able to so far. So it's been interesting at how much contemporary art now actually is around cloth and fabric and the pliable membrane and the responsive membrane that cloth is. It's the hand that is always touching us. And so it is our constant company. So when I did, I'm showing a really early work. You can tell by the color of my hair in this picture. And this was a project. It's a man's suit. It's covered in painted toothpicks. And those painted toothpicks become an animate hide as I stand inside of it, because one's breathing and one's blood is coursing through one's body. And I put myself on display. And it was sort of the beginning for me of, through the work, addressing one's own predicament and the way I think I got into making, I think in some ways because I was attracted to the immersions of making and a kind of form of attention that doing things with my hand brings, and the way it sort of silences the self-conscious voice that so often inhibits making. And here, it's the opposite, though. Like, I've put myself very self-consciously on display as a way of kind of doing both. And I think that attraction to making, to whether it's solitary or, in the case of a project like this, very social, with many hands working, there's there's this ease and sociability that comes through the necessity of a task that is manual, that doesn't necessarily need a lot of skill, but allows a certain kind of company. So in the spirit of responding to circumstances, this is many years later, this is a project called Privations and Excesses that was in San Francisco in the Mission District. And it was the first time that I had a break from full-time teaching. I'd been teaching at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And I had a budget of $7,000, and I had this space, and I had 3 months of time. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. And so I walked a lot around the Mission District, and it was a much rougher place than it is today. But I was always very aware of what change I had in my pocket or didn't have relative to that money being asked for on the street. And so through a series of kind of experiences, I thought, well, I'm going to take the budget for this project and I'm going to convert it into the material. And so the $8,000 was in the form of pennies. And pennies actually in this accumulation have no legal tender, so you can't pay taxes with pennies or a very large Visa bill. And we laid it into a bed of honey. So on the floor is the product of an animal economy, and on top is this kind of Liberace jacket or kind of mosaic of the swirling eddies of pennies that have all been laid by hand with a team of volunteers. And when you walk in, it's a former garage, and you walk in, and you can immediately smell something you can't quite see, is that you can smell the sheep that are living at the back of the space. And like us, they're social. And I think they're witnesses. So when you walked in, it was the conjunction of the animal and the display of money that really kind of presented itself. And I think it's in those two senses crossing that the piece resides. I didn't know that when I was making it. And there was another element, and this has been often a constant presence in my work, is that the process of making, which can be very satisfying, but is not always part of the public life of a work, comes forward in the act of an attendant. And so here, there was always someone, usually was somebody who had volunteered to help make the project, who was wringing their hands in a hat full of honey. So it's the animal and the human economy, and then there were these mechanical, like mortar and pestles that were grinding away teeth. So you have human teeth and animal teeth being pulverized, and you have this luxuriating of the material substance of the honey. And it's a world of relations. So the animal presence in the work has been there all along in different ways, not always live, but maybe I should just say about the pennies is that it was in the city, and there were a lot of kids that in an elementary school down the street that had never seen a sheep. And they were like, what kind of animal is that? And also, I was in like the corner store getting a coffee after we opened, and they were like, I hear there's this project that's really improving the neighborhood. So I don't think I'm responsible for the gentrification of the Mission District, but it did attract a lot of people, and it was partly the circumstances of how it was presented. We left the garage door open. It had never had an art project in it, so in fact one day someone drove their car in to get repaired. But it was something like you could find it, and so when you found it, it had a different sense of, I don't know, like discovery for you, because someone hadn't told you to go see it. You hadn't gone through these other thresholds. And I think that there's an aspect of that that has been very generous to my work, like when I've been able to place things that have complete institutional support, but they aren't necessarily through institutional thresholds in terms of your arrival there. I want the best of both worlds. I don't know, what can I say? But this project at DIA, which Jack also suggested I just show, is one where, again, underfoot, there is the product of an animal economy. So you couldn't walk on those pennies, but you could walk on this undulating floor of hair made out of horsetail. And so it's something that grows from the inside out. It is an oceanic kind of extension. And in the middle of this ocean was a person reading. But they were reading in a really particular way because they were reading with a hot stylus, and that was actually transforming the printed word into the smoke, into air. It's ingested as you breathe the air. And so I like to think that the printed word is materialized through this process of reading with a hot stylus. And everyone reads differently, and everyone's hand is different, and the books record that. So I was invited to do, I should just back up and say that I have not so much had a studio practice, that most of my work has been made in response to the invitation to work in a particular kind of space or with a particular kind of project, whether it's like pinhole camera project or partnering artists with industries, or the invitation to possibly build something on someone's property. And I had the most, I think, extraordinary invitation from Christy Edmonds, a curator at the Park Avenue Armory, to have the drill hall to work in, which is an entire city block. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking a lot about I wanted to read to New York City, and that reading is one of the most intimate, physically intimate things we do if we read to one another. And how do you take that proximity and intimacy and actually make that and how does that experience, I guess, come forward in a public space? And so I decided that maybe one way to think about that was to read to the pigeons. And so you see here, J.Ed, one of the actors from City Company, who I collaborated with. And the pigeons came from Ohio. So we tried to train the pigeons in Ohio to fly to the sound of a school bell. And they would know that it was time to eat. You can see they didn't go in. They kind of did the same thing at the Armory, but they did start to fly over a white cloth and come in. And so we mailed them to New York City, which is that's the official transport for birds. You cannot Federal Express birds, just so you know. And the person I got the pigeons from, he actually works with a lot of people who have racing pigeons, and they're homing pigeons. And so my attraction partly to the pigeon is that they can find their way back. We did not have time to raise a generation of pigeons where we'd be able to train them to leave the Armory and come back. So we tried to train them every day to fly across the space. And here they are. This is their first night, getting settled, eating, etc. And this is the building where they're housed. And one thing about the history of the Armory is it was built by subscription to protect the neighborhood at the time before there was a police force, when there were militias. And it had no windows in from the outside. It's like a fortress. But part of the mandate of the Armory, which is to house the 7th Regiment, is also to provide care. And so there's a women's shelter on one floor. The regiment practices on another. There's a quite active art program now. And there are a lot of other community events that happen there. And at any moment, it can be requisitioned again and be taken over if there's a public emergency. So it faces Park Avenue. It's between Park Avenue and Lexington in the 60s. And this is the drill hall. And so this was literally where the regiment trained. It was where Queen Elizabeth was welcomed to New York City. There have been numerous civic events and fundraisers, radio plays produced there, movies. For a while, they hosted the indoor tennis championship. all of that factors into the research and making a project. But the thing that most struck me when I was working in their archive was looking at the photograph of the training of the various regiments over several generations. And in these photographs of these summer exercises or weekend exercises, what I saw was this incredible tenderness in the way the men interacted together. Even though there's all this facade of the uniform and the rifles and the parade of that, there was also this tenderness, and I wanted to bring that forward with the reading. So the piece is called The Event of a Thread, and that refers to Annie Albers, who was the head of textiles at the Bauhaus, who describes a cloth, the crossing of two threads as contact is always an event, and a cloth is only made from those crossings. So this is a giant weaving that takes place in the architecture of the drill hall. And I immediately, when I visited, registered these enormous iron trusses that are 80 feet overhead. And sometimes one's response is very immediate, and in this case it was, because I thought, oh, how fantastic to swing from there. And you know, part of the challenge is working in a big space like that, not how to fill it, but actually how to engage it and how to work with different, I don't know, temperatures of motion. So I wanted to also address, I think, socially, this impasse we are in politically and socially in so many ways. And so it's a little bit like, I don't know, like a Red Rover game a little bit. But in the middle, there's a giant white cloth that is actually held in place by ropes that come off the swings. So there's a field of swings on either side of the cloth. And when you swing, the cloth registers the turbulence of your movement, and it connects on across in the system to the swing on the other side. So there's this reciprocity. So even though someone's really far away on the other side of the Armory, you could actually feel their weight. And if they were in sync with you like this, it felt one way, and it went up and down in another way. And if they were opposite, it had like a different quality. And what happened is the curtain raised and lowered so you could see each other through there. But it also kept the heartbeat for the project. And this is just the system of the cloth and all the lines. So it wasn't like a cloth that was hung and then animated by the swings. Literally, the ropes from the swings hold it in space. And so everything is visible. And we knew that the middle was an edge and it would be important, but we had no idea that, we didn't know if people would even get on the swings. But we also had no idea that people would really gather and stay. And so that center, it's like it became a park in some ways. And people nursed their babies, people got engaged. There were a lot of things that happened socially. And so this middle is kind of very active. And on the perimeters of the piece, there is reading and writing, which is always in some ways present in my work. And so here is J.Ed reading to the pigeons from a concordance that is a structuring of a text through the repetition of certain words. And as you came into the Armory, you approached them. They're reading into microphones. And the pigeons, I do think, really responded to the voice. But the voice is actually carried around in paper bags, so that it's a low-watt radio broadcast. And so if you have a lunch bag with a radio in it, it's vibrating just a little bit. And so you have this intimacy. You can carry around this voice, but you don't necessarily have to be close to the reader. And at the opposite end, I worked with 40 or 50 writers who came and in 2.5-hour stints wrote letters to qualities of the space, like dear far, dear light, and improvised, in response to their time being present in the space. And their only view of the curtain was through this mirror that rotated as the curtain went up and down. So they could look up and have a retrospective view. And their forward-facing view was to Lexington Avenue. So for the first time in the history of the Armory, we put a window in. And so it's never been open to view. And so there was this whole theater going on Lexington of people like, what's going on in there? And one of the things I think I feel most proud about, I think, is that as they move forward out of this project for the renovation of the space, they're going to keep that transparent. And so, that's the residue of this project. The rhythm of the day was such that at the end, there was a vocalist every night that sang a piece that was made from the concordance. It's a composition by David Lang, and it was a short a cappella piece that was really sung to the pigeons, and it would quiet the space. And then afterwards, we would carry the pigeons to under the cloth, because they never learned how to fly over the cloth. And they would fly, and that was how. So every day in the Armory kind of had a rhythm of this, the singing, and then the pigeon release. And when just before this took place, during the vocalist, we actually cut a live record, and so it's an acetate record. We restored this record cutter. And actually, the residue of that cutting is this most ethereal blue thread. And, when I saw that the first time we were playing with it, it was, in some ways, I understood the project. Like, I didn't plan that. It was like a gift. And I think that, that's what making work is. It's like, it's making the circumstance for these things to happen that you actually can't determine happening. So I think this is Katie Geisinger, who sings with Meredith Monk and is an artist that I've worked with a couple of times. There we go. So it's time, school. So what we thought we'd do is, Catherine was maybe going to go through images if we wanted, but Jack and I were going to have some questions from you, and we'll go from there. See. What else can I tell you about this? One of the things that I just want to say about this project is that I was there every day, and it happened in December. It was after Hurricane Sandy in New York, and I think that people needed to be together, and the swings, the way they take your weight because you're so low on the pendulum, it's not like those swings on the playground, that go like this, because it's so high. It's more like a magic carpet, you're going like this, and so I think what happens is when something takes your weight, you fall open. Your heart falls open. Your body gives away, and I think people were incredibly generous with each other. There were no fights for swings, no lines. It had this kind of park-like feel, and every day was a little different, and it was really a kind of really amazing thing for me to be able to stay with it and take care of it and learn from it and not leave right after the opening. So
actually, that's a perfect.
Is that a perfect segue?
Fold into
okay. All right. So we're going to go over here. So that was the Reader's Digest version. It's a really
The
careening.
large type version.
Yeah. Yeah.
So actually, well, thank you, Anne, so much for doing this. And this event is really geared towards students, so I'm going to ask questions that I think may be left out of a different kind of talk. But this piece sort of folds into something that I've always wondered about your work, which is that your work has this very social aspect. And I think of your work as people-centric in the sense that people are either objects or they're performers or they're participating in the piece as an audience or conversely, I've seen your projects, how they just attract really interesting people sort of in the creation of them as well. So and so we live in a world where practice is defined as social or relational, but when you were generating your work early on, those models didn't really exist in the way that they're familiar to us now. So like, how did you decide, or how did you know that that was sort of where you want to go with your projects?
So, I mean, I really grew up in a household where there was a lot of volunteer work going on, and I was in that conversation, and I was helping. And I think that probably is the true origin of it. And then I think a lot of when I wanted to work on a scale that was larger than my scale, that by necessity I needed help. And so it was, I think some of my friends would say, well, you're not going to get to spend any time with Anne unless you go help her. And I think that it was always pretty informal. It wasn't formally structured. It was like the necessity of getting something done and people kicking in. And then, like laying the pennies in honey, it's sort of miserable when you're doing it by yourself. But when you have a bunch of other people with you, there's another conversation that happens. And I think I was very, and continue to be very interested in that conversation. So I think the work actually, I think maybe early on, like there would be this making, and then that would all disappear, and there would be maybe a solo figure there, like all alone in the landscape. And then I think as the work has grown, and I've been able to also been fortunate enough to do one kind of architectural project, build a boat that's really meant for carrying a lot of people, that I'm thinking much more about how do you make a circumstance for people to be together. And that's, I think, how I asked the question. And I think, especially around the Armory, and the question has really continued to really occupy me is, what is civic space now? And like, where and how do we make it, and how do we animate it? And what are the questions that need to be asked, and what needs to be said in it? And so I keep using that word condition. What's the condition that allows something to cross, or for contact to be made?
Are you looking at other kinds of models of civic space as a way of thinking about that?
For a long time, I've had this book checked out from the library that's like of, literally the insides of civic spaces in small cities around the country, and like courthouses and community centers. It's not so much community centers there. Like I love the Quaker church and shape note singing, and the idea that there's a square and there's a way to participate, because I think it's really hard for us to see the ways in which we can really participate in political processes right now, social processes. And not that I think that's so obvious in the work, but
I can't resist sort of thinking about when I first experienced your work when we were in graduate school, and you just had this, like, the rest of us all thought in like what we could make in 1 week, and we thought in semesters, we thought in like within the space of our studio, and you just like knew right away, like you just had this scale that like for something that was larger than the field of your vision, something that that where a space or a thing or an experience where you were sort of diminished in scale, but also you registered within the scale of the piece. So how did you, again, like how did you know that that's what you, yeah.
I think it's this, it's kind of like a bodily feeling too, of like wanting to make something that like has a real physical intimacy, like the lap, and then to be lost or engulfed in a landscape. And so I think the reciprocal movement between those is something that's been in the work for a long time. I think, well, I mean, partly is that I'm a terrible object maker. Terrible. And it's sort of partly because I think, like cloth, I think about the relationship between the threads. I think spatially about the relationship, like how did the reader and the writer face each other and across what distance? And so I'm, like when I work a lot in plan, and I'm thinking about like how one thing addresses another. And so I think that, I found my object by like reaching to the edge of the space where I was. So that it also implies that it goes on beyond the space you're in. Mm-hmm. But I think, partly it's a textile thing, like pushing. I didn't know when to stop something, so if I knew if I went to the edge of the architecture, it would stop me. I mean, and that, I quite literally, right? So it's like I didn't have to decide then how big it was because the room was going to decide that. Or
so you said you were a terrible object maker, but yet there's incredible sort of material manipulation going on in your work. How do you reconcile those two things?
I don't. No, I mean, this is an ongoing thing for me, because it's like mostly the work is ephemeral. Mostly it's the circumstance or the live time, but it's not theater. It's theatrical in a lot of ways. But and then what is it that feels like it has veracity, that is a residue or context of that, like artifact of that? Or is there other kind of making that comes from the process that you've learned from doing the big projects? And I think it's a little bit of both. I think photography's had a presence for a long time, and I think that comes forward. I think the work is really material, and I feel like I should be able to do something with that doesn't require an acre of space. But that's really hard for me to find that form, honestly. Really, it's because then I want to put it across from this, or I want it to be in relationship to that. And so I think mostly it comes forward in the photography. Yeah, and I'm thinking a lot also about books right now, about how like the book is like this beautiful democratic object, and it's portable and it has rhythm. And it's in your hand, but like when you fall into a book, you're also falling into this other world that extends like a landscape, even if it's not literally one. And so I think that kind of close at hand and far away, which is how I would characterize reading, is carried always in a book. Like when I'm really frazzled, if I just can read for 20 minutes, I feel like I'm restored.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah. So,
but the other thing, and I mentioned this just a moment ago, like it seems that writing or text is a way that you use text as a way to construct images, and writing has always seemed to be a really important part of your practice, and so I'm wondering if you could sort of extend that connection of the book to writing, because like I remember even in some of the early, I don't remember ever seeing a show of yours where it wasn't accompanied by a text that you wrote, and also, but torture. You have, but you have a very like a way of writing that's very crisp, it's very lucid, but at the same time it's porous and very sort of open open-ended in terms of the way you read the text, and it seems to function in a way that's very analogous to the kind of construction of images. And we're talking about this because I was thinking that, was sort of reminded of that looking at your website and how the sort of all these pieces also that are tied up with language. I mean, you showed tropos, and there are many. So, yeah.
That's a great. Well, thank you for reading, Jack. Really.
All you need is 20 minutes of reading,
and you'll be restored. I'm looking over at Nicole Gibbs, who directs the studio, because we do a lot of editing together. And my husband's an artist, Michael Mersil, and he really helps edit. And he always talks about but preserving the voice that's in the bad grammar. Yeah, it's partly being really wanting to develop a vocabulary to be very particular about how things are named, because how things are named can close something down or open it up, and how something is named determines how you think about it, right? And so I think, for me, it's and especially working with a lot of the grad students who are writing their thesis and trying to find a voice to write in. And it's how do you find a voice to write in that's the voice of the work, that's not sort of stepping outside and trying to justify it or explain it. And so I think my approach has always been to be descriptive in some particular way, because it's if you can really describe what and how something is, in that is all this complex of relations. And it alleviates one of other kind of responsibilities in the writing, at least for me. So does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so, and then the other thing is that when I make work, I make a lot of lists of words, because it's this relationship between things. And so I think what I'm doing is writing down words that are about the qualities of things. And so, because it's a quality of this speed in relationship to light, in relationship to sound, that's very particular, and that's where a piece is. And so wanting to, just wanting to describe that, because it's one way I actually get to the work, because the words allow me to recognize something that I'm doing that I don't know necessarily that I'm doing. So it gives me handles to keep going. And I think reading's the same way.
So how do you? So I'm going to ask about reading, because the other aspect of your work that to me seems very prescient is that it's very now we think of a whole kind of genre of work as research-based.
Yeah.
And your work, I wouldn't describe you that way, but your work is always invested in a lot of unearthing information and sort of both deliberate and serendipitous discoveries. And so the question is how do you choose what to read? But also the kind of larger question is if you just do deliberate research, you end up with kind of anticipated results, and if you just wait for the kind of serendipitous discovery, then nothing may come of it. So how do you sort of
how do you do that?
How do you do that?
How do you do that?
I think you should. I believe you should indulge in as much serendipitous sort of research as you can accommodate, and place no expectation on that anything will come of it.
Yeah, because it seems like everything happens by some sort of intentional accident or something, or some accident of. I think that reading is a place to get started, because you work from what you know to what you don't know, but for the recognition of finding something. And I think that I pay a lot of attention to footnotes and references to other books. And then, it's like we're searching on the computer. You're down a rabbit hole very quickly. But pretty soon, something yields itself, and, it's your recognition, aha, that you have a piece of information that's intersecting with some observation of a space or site or question. And you start to kind of twine those together, really. And it isn't like that research really ever in the end is maybe what the project is about, but that it makes this landscape that allows it to happen. And so, I think that there's a certain point in a process where I get very nervous if I don't feel like I've found the company of the right books to be immersed in. And in the end, those in many ways fall away, but I've been thinking and trying to find form for a number of years now for how the act of reading can become the material of the work. And those kind of accidental intersections of things. Like, is that recognition that happens when you find something in your reading that you weren't looking for? Is that an experience that you can actually structure and for someone else to do that kind of finding? Not determine what that is.
I appreciated that you shared with us that your sort of interest in the algae collection here.
Yes.
And that dead-ended.
Yeah.
And now that Andre Bober has made all our collections more visible to us.
Yes, this amazing book. Yay.
So.
Oh.
So I want to say, because this is an audience of students, that if you guys were able to fast forward like 30, 40 years and you'd see one of the things you would discover is that the people that you're in school with and that you're sort of are in your community now will probably be there if you were able to fast forward. But I'm curious, Anne, as if you could go back to your student self and what would you want to know or do differently? It's sort of or what would you tell these guys about what you should make sure you get while you're in art school?
Good question.
Or stay away from, or contest, or absorb.
Yeah, it's such a hard thing to know, in that dilemma. Do you stay in your studio, wherever your studio is, or do you go to the lecture, right? Or the film, or the performance, or whatever. I think the thing is you have to trust yourself. You have to actually listen to yourself. I think that's a big part of it. But Adam and I had a studio visit last night, and we were talking about the importance of recognizing that you have a question that you can actually work with for a long time. It may sound really simple in some ways, your question, but that it has a lot of density in it, and that it will sustain your investigation, and that you don't know where it's going to take you, but it's much more important to have a good question than anything else, I think. And I think the other thing is, this thing about trust is to trust where your attention is drawn. And I think that's a big part of my own process, so that when I'm starting a project or walking a space, it isn't necessarily that those first impressions are the most important ones, but it's that I pay attention to what I start thinking about. Or, there's a very associative brain that I think is very smart. And that if I pay attention to where the attention is drawn, there's a reason for that, and there's something in that. And that my task or my work is to go into that and to draw it out and draw it to the surface. The other thing is, there's a wonderful writer, Rebecca Solnit, who I was in residence with in the Headlands for a number of years, and who's gone on to be just an incredible intellect and writer. And she, when she has talks about how, right when you're in school and you're in your teens and 20s, it's like you're filling up with those things that are going to sustain your practice maybe 20 or 30 years down the road. And so, don't worry about if it seems like it connects, because it's so often it's all the way you're each going to knit all these things together in your own experience. And so I just always have taken that away from her, to to fill up because it's the food you need for the thinking you're going to be doing for a long time in the future, and it will sustain your practice.
You and I are just going to have to agree to disagree about whether Adam should listen to himself.
Oh.
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I couldn't help but think of Adam's work when you were showing all those bird images, and I was actually thinking that was an interesting discussion that you guys could have. So.
Yeah, there's the bird brain. The birds are incredibly intelligent.
So,
does anyone have questions, or are we done? No questions? Oh. Yeah.
So we'd love, yes.
Well, so it's really tricky because you have to be really open, right? And you have to be really willing to hear what someone is maybe saying to you. And you have to know, and sometimes you don't know for 10 years if that's something that really applied to you or you need to listen to or not. So, I mean, I think, that it was such a different time when I was going back to school and I was coming out of like a craft context. And there these categories are very tricky, and our attitude towards them really changed and is changing. But I think, there was on my part like a real nervousness about it not being serious or it not being art, or because it was, like craft had a kind of debased sort of connotation because it's contaminated by the body or whatever. And so I think, that I was very sensitive to that question at the time, and it's like, but you have to also not be so bullheaded to think that you know everything you need to know. But it's like some instinct about what's really important to listen to, even when it's uncomfortable. And I think that in some ways the challenge of that question is coming up now for me as I really think about, well, what does it mean to work in these materials right now, and trying to find another form for myself. I don't know, it's like, your instincts about these things are also really important, and you don't know, you don't know, like maybe that the really tough crit was exactly right because of where it took you, And so I think it's to try to also remove the judgmental voice, and to kind of pay attention to, like, what's the information in here that I need to really listen to.
What do you do with your students? And you famously had a tenure track job and you got tenure and then quit, and then left academia and then returned to it. So, how do you work with students? What do you?
I think we do a lot about how to recognize the questions that you have, and how do you work out of that. So I feel like partly as a teacher, mostly I'm working with graduate students now, I feel like one of my things is to really listen. And in listening, kind of bring something up to the surface that maybe isn't on the surface. And I think that in one of the seminars that I teach with my husband, Michael, I think, are very focused on this question of how to ask a question. That sounds kind of abstract, doesn't it? How's that sit, Jack?
That makes a lot of sense.
I feel like that's happening all the time. I feel like I'm as close to some things I made back then, or still, like, everything's a circle in a lot of ways. I think that, the reason I put the toothpick suit up is because that continues to be a really important turning point in my thinking for me, and it was partly where I understood this difference between picturing and demonstrating something. And so how does something become like an embodied demonstration versus like a picture of a relation? And And I think that that is, that's always in my head when if I feel like I'm getting really seduced by wanting to make an image happen, that it's like, it's kind of like wrong-headed in some ways, and I need to find my way back out of that. Yeah.
So. Other questions?
Wow, that's really good. Oh, there's one. There's one. Yeah, I mean, some of them are up here. So, can I give a little bit of a long answer? Yeah, do I have time? So this project in some ways came out of what I would call like a side project that started a number of years ago, where I was part of a project called Factory Direct that the Warhol Museum put on. And they invited artists to partner with industry, corporations, small businesses in Pittsburgh and try to collaborate or make a project together in some way. And I was partnered with Bayer Material Sciences. And they're like Bayer Aspirin, but this is their US headquarters for material sciences research. And one of the things they do is they engineer chemically the way surfaces perform. And my work is so much about touch and contact and that reciprocity that we had a lot of interesting conversations, but it was really hard to know what to make out of that. So one of the researchers gave me this membrane, which is called Texan, or Dermoflex. It's a rubber plastic. And he said, you made like this. And I put my hand underneath it and immediately was just really compelled by how when you touch this surface, from underneath, it's in focus, but everything else is very soft. And I started thinking about how I might work with that photographically. So that's the process that actually we're engaged with here. And I think one of the qualities of that fabric is that when, and Jack has been photographed, so I don't know, I don't know if this is true for you, but when you stand behind it, you can't see through. And so although you know there's a camera on the other side, and my voice is directing, it's highly self-conscious, like it's a photo shoot. But on the other hand, it's also like you're in a private space. And I think there are moments where there's something maybe what I might describe as being like a quality of interiority that I see in some of the images. And, it's interesting as we think about, we live in where the notion of what is private or having private images or private space is something that's really changing a lot. And so I think there's something about this process of photography that creates the condition that creates these images. And so in partnering with the Dell Medical here, the associative leap for me is to think about that touch and human recognition is the core of medicine. And I was very influenced by reading a book by John Berger called A Fortunate Man. It's a story of a country doctor and the very particular relationship in a traditional, more peasant economy of the doctor to the community. And yet still, like, when someone really sits in front of you and listens, they cannot feel your pain, but maybe they can hear that. I think there's some of that in these photographs. There's a book by Elaine Scarry called The Body and Pain, The Making and Unmaking of the World. And in that book, she writes about how pain is, the experience of pain is something that another person can never experience. Like, no matter how articulate I am, no matter how I describe or chart it, you cannot feel that pain. And so the task of culture and language, I'm really simplifying her book, but is to bridge that gap. And I think about that a lot in relationship to the presence of empathy in the work, the relationship between the human and animal, and so it comes forward in this photo project in a really particular way. So like today, we were at Westminster, a retirement community. We've been at Dell Children's Hospital, community clinics. We've been on the UT campus, photographing in just different circumstance, people that in some way are part of that system of care.
When will that project be completed? Is there
It's sort of ongoing.
Uh-huh.
Finding form, this problem of finding form. So we have a plan, but we don't have a deadline. But one of the things I'm very interested in as I've kind of been looking at these, and these are just kind of JPEGs of some of the images, is that they're not really, I'm not so much looking at them as portraits, but I'm looking for that place of contact. And so, and the way that there's a gesture in this moment in time that is, caught by the camera. And is there a way for me to edit those? And so I've been looking at them as becoming a book, becoming a giveaway newspaper, becoming something that might have a permanent presence as baked enamel in the architecture, but can circulate in all these other forms. Yeah. Yeah, good. Oh, should we take 2 more questions? Do we have time?
Yeah, let's do it quickly.
Okay, Amy.
With the thumb.
Oh, the alphabet. That's a video that I made a number of years ago, and so it's just my index finger. And it's not really from a project. It was just made on its own. And it was, so I, with rubber stamps, stamped the alphabet on a piece of glass, and then my finger's wet. And so it's like trying to absorb the alphabetic into the body. And then it's like my finger's like a snail, kind of going around. And then it loops and it goes backwards, so the alphabet writes itself back. And so it's this, to me, it's a video that's so much about this, like falling into language and needing our ability to language our experience, and then falling back into this kind of materiality that is absorptive and resists language. And so I think that's what you see. I think the other thing about it, I shot it, I don't know how many times, many times, and it wasn't until I understood that the camera needed to move with the finger. Like it couldn't be an act just performing for, the camera wasn't the witness. That was just this dispassionate, still fixed mechanism that and I still work with these little miniature surveillance cameras that they actually kind of don't make them exactly like this anymore, but that it's like a pencil in my hand, and so it's very fluid, and so I could follow it, and I think that's why that video works for me. It's that, but not being able to exactly follow. So what I find is if things have 3 rhythms in them, something else starts to happen. Yeah, Bogdan. So Bogdan and I taught together in Santa Barbara.
Jack mentioned relational aesthetics, and you said you don't use this term very much. Significant root. I wonder how you use this term when you mean that.
Well, I think that I'm, increasingly trying to think about these projects as, can I think about them as ecological systems in any way? The kind of wasteful ones, but I think that's a way that I'm starting to try to think about the work. There's a system, and then there's a consequence of a system that actually forms a work. And I'm being really literal too, in terms of obviously the hive makes the honey that sustains the bees, right? And that You know, the abstract, although pennies are material in that case, you know, they represent an abstract system of exchange. And so those two systems of exchange are then present in the relationship between those two materials. Is that your question? Not really. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jack.